Hello, everyone. We are live. Welcome to the Shaun Attwood channel. Tonight, I am joined by an incredible guest who has possibly one of the most important shows I'm going to do rather to share with you. He has some groundbreaking information. And tonight I am joined by Tom Sykes, from The Royalist, the Substack you have, and also the European editor at large at the Daily Beast. Welcome to the show.
Thanks very much, Lauren. Great to be here.
Great to have you. Now, you have been working on an incredible piece of journalism on your Substack, and I would urge everyone to follow The Royalist on Substack. It is incredible. So I just want to read to get viewers prepared for this show, because it really is going to be something. So you believe that Princess Diana was deliberately unalived. Days before the 28th anniversary of the death of Diana, Tom Sykes writes on his Substack, The Royalist, that he can no longer accept the official version of events that her death was an accident. You started by covering the British royal family when Diana died, and you've been the Beast's royalist correspondent since 2011. Your brilliant reporting has resulted in scoop after scoop about the most studied family in the world. Your decision to break ranks on the cause of the most significant event in recent royal history will cause shockwaves. You explain in your full essay, which is a sweeping 3,300 words, the unexplained questions, the catalogue of errors which surrounded the charity, and why you now believe that a powerful group of insiders in the British security services were behind the unaliving, and that it was conducted without the knowledge or consent of the royals themselves. Now, that's some intro. And we briefly spoke before we came on and went live. And I said, even from the grave, Diana is still making headlines. She is still so prominent in the news agenda. Take us back on the start of your investigative work with this, because you know the royals and everything there is to know inside out. And you were very, I saw your interview with Dan Wootton, you were very cautious about saying, you know, this isn't, you don't want this to be seen as a conspiracy theory. And obviously 28 years ago when Diana died, it could have been seen as that.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Lauren. And I've had an incredible reaction to this piece that I wrote. And one of the brilliant things that I've really loved about Substack is that even the people who disagreed with me have done so, you know, really not courteously, but respectfully. Like, we've just been able to have a conversation about it, which has been really cool. So it's been an amazing kind of experience for me writing on this new platform where you have all this engagement with your readers and lots of back and forth. But just to rewind, okay, you and I know who Princess Diana was. My kids, who are 19, they don't really know who she was. They watched a bit of The Crown, so they know a bit. But I think it's easy to forget that Diana was literally the most famous person on the planet on the 31st of August in 1997. There was nobody more famous than her, and she divided opinion very, very sharply. And one of my real memories of waking up on Sunday morning, waking up late, I'm afraid, because I'd been at a party the night before, and the Sunday papers arrived, and they were full of little slips of paper saying, "We're terribly sorry about this awful article we wrote, saying hideous things about Princess Diana on pages 7, 9, 11, 14. You know, we wrote it before we knew that she'd been in a car accident and died." She was she was the most famous person on the planet. She was incredibly divisive, and a lot of that stemmed, obviously, you know, the whole story was so extraordinary. She was 20 years old when she married Charles. Charles was 32. She was this innocent little nursery school teacher. He was, hard as it is to believe now, an international playboy. Charles had really wanted to marry Camilla. He hadn't been allowed because Camilla wasn't a virgin. I mean, unbelievable kind of medieval stuff ruling the royal family, you know, 35, 40 years ago. He was pretty much pushed into the marriage by his by his father, particularly, who wrote him a letter telling him he had to make an honest woman of her and that she was great. She was a Spencer, very posh family, much posher than the Windsors, born on the Sandringham estate. Diana was perfect on paper. And I think that, frankly, the palace thought that they could manipulate her. And they thought, here's this, doe-eyed little 20-year-old who we can completely control to our whim and who'll do whatever we want. And Diana fairly quickly had other ideas. She found out on the eve of her wedding that her husband to be the next day was still having an affair with Camilla Parker Bowles, and they were sending each other, cufflinks on the eve. Imagine that, the day before you're going to get married in the most high-profile wedding ceremony in the world, and your whole life was going to be set in stone. Your husband's being given cufflinks with F and G for Fred and Gladys, which were Camilla and Charles's nicknames for each other. It's just unbelievable. And so Diana apparently called her sister that evening and said, he's still having a relationship with Camilla. I don't know if I can go through with it. And her sister, Sarah McCorkadale, said, well, you have to Dutch because your face is on the tea towels, was famously what she said. And I think it's kind of really relevant to consider that context because, we say nowadays, Meghan's very famous, Kate's very famous, all that. The Diana was unbelievably, she was the most high profile person in the world, which is why when she died in a car crash on the 31st of August 1997, the sort of catalogue of lackadaisical, just crazy things that were just not done by the police or done very badly by the police just absolutely do not make any sense at all. And I mean, we can start wherever you want.
I think it's also a really important point to make is how the royals are ultimately one with the mainstream media, and Diana really caused a huge issue because she wouldn't fall in line. And so you had someone who was operating outside of the firm. And if people think Meghan is troublesome now, Diana, and I'm a massive Diana fan, but Diana did what Diana wanted to do. And it's hard to 28 years down the line, when we have social media, when we have so many other things where people can communicate and the press is so different, it's hard to actually remember how different time was then. There were 4 TV channels, print press was king, and for Diana to operate outside of the kind of strict confines that she was in posed a massive problem.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. So Diana didn't have access to social media. But what she did have access to was journalists. And Diana was a master at manipulating and organizing the coverage that she wanted. Great friends and always very lengthy phone calls, famously with Richard Kay. She was very friendly with my friend, Lady Colin Campbell. She was regularly would tip off photographers of where she was. And I think that this is sometimes used as sort of evidence, say, well, Diana was sort of terrible, conniving, this, that, or the other. But I think it's important to remember that there wasn't any other way of getting your story across then, other than trying to work with the mainstream media and trying to get them to put your side of the story. I'm sure you, as a celebrity publicist, will know how important that was in a way that it really isn't now. Because these days, if the Daily Mail writes something about that you don't like, well, you can actually just post. If you're sufficiently famous, you can just post your own. I mean, Diana, my God, she would have ruled Instagram. I mean, with a click of the shutter finger. But yeah, so she was trouble, shall we put it that way. And she was never more trouble than when she went on Panorama in 1996 and not only accused and revealed that Charles had been having an affair throughout their marriage with Camilla Parker Bowles, using the immortal line, well, there were 3 of us in the marriage, so it was very crowded. But she also said that she didn't believe that Charles should be king. She said that he didn't think that he had what it took. And she said that she thought that he didn't want to be king because he knew he wasn't up to it. And I genuinely think that kind of more or less signed her death warrant, because I think that, you know, I always compare it a bit to Thomas à Becket, right? So Thomas à Becket was the Archbishop of Canterbury in the Middle Ages, and the king said famously, "Who will rid me of this turbulent priest?" And 4 knights decided to go and kill Thomas à Becket, but they said to themselves, "We're not going to tell the king first, because the king will have to tell us not to go. But he wants it done," you know. And my view is that is what happened. That there were forces within the establishment, within the security services, particularly, who just saw that, you know, if Diana carried on and was to carry on being given a platform and carrying on making, as you say, making trouble that she's made. You know, the other way I put this is, I'm like, can you really imagine that we would have a Queen Camilla today if Princess Diana was still alive? I can't. I just can't see it. If it was Diana going on Netflix, going on Oprah, saying how awful Charles was, all the awful things he'd done, the affair, you know, she couldn't. Diana's death kind of got rid of all of that. It wiped the slate clean, and it meant that, you know, Charles could move forward. So I think there's, like, look, clearly Diana's death was very convenient for a lot of people. It really was. As of the question of who actually did it, which is what everybody, you know, always wants to ask and always wants to know, I genuinely, I think it's probably too far back in time to pin it on individual people or name individual names, beyond saying that it was a group of very well connected, very powerful people within the establishment and the security services whose interests it served. But yeah, I mean, I suppose my first job in journalism, I was working in the Evening Standard in 1997. I mean, that's when I left college, and that dates me. I'm 51. And the offices were in Kensington High Street. So, like, I'd been out of college like 2 months. I'd done loads of work at college, so I'd managed to get a job straight at the Evening Standard. And it was just mental. Like, the place was besieged. There were thousands of people on the streets. You could not get to work. And the smell of rotting flowers that hung over Kensington, I mean, it's something I'll never forget. It was the most disgusting, awful smell. And it just symbolized to me this whole sort of putrefaction and decay of, like, it was just all so awful. You know, everything was so terrible. And the boys being paraded in front of the public. Yeah. And, you know, I thought Harry wrote incredibly movingly about that in his memoir, when he talks about all these people crying, going, "We're so sorry." And he's like, "Why are you crying? You didn't even know her." Do you know what I mean? Yeah. And I remember at the time, you know, a lot of people, and there are a lot of people to this day. Actually, Peter Hitchens is brilliant about this in the Mail. He just says, as far as he's concerned, the whole world went mad on the day that Diana died and never really recovered. Because here they were weeping on the streets for somebody they'd never met, they never knew anything about, like we were in North Korea or something. I mean, it was like, literally, we used to laugh at those things on television of, like, people in the streets in China, you know, sobbing because the dear leader had died, and here we were doing it. And I think it did have a massive impact on the country, because it did kind of reset our sort of willingness to emote in public and all that kind of stuff. But I'm getting off the,
I think as well, just
the key thing here.
You go into your findings. I think, you know, at the time when Diana was such a threat, not only was she playing the media, and she had them in many ways wrapped around her finger, and she knew what would make front page news, but Hollywood was made for Diana. You know, she was that old school Hollywood glamour. It was likely she would probably move to America, and the royals would not have a chance of competing with the trajectory that Diana was on, and that Diana would have made happen for herself. So yeah, on that note, share the secrets.
Okay, so what I must say, right, when this first happened, right, and I was working at the Evening Standard, and the inquiries started to come out, you know, in a couple of years afterwards. So there's there are three inquiries, right? First of all, there's the French police. That takes about a year. Then Mohammed Fayed complains to the police. He lodges a complaint with the police that says, these are all the reasons that I believe there was a cover up and why Diana was unalived. And, you know, this is who I believe did it. And the police, to kind of smooth the whole thing over and make it look like they're taking it seriously, which they were, to be fair. I mean, there's plenty of people in the police force who took this very seriously. You know, it's a very intense kind of 800-page report. So trust me, there were plenty of people who wanted to get to the bottom of it. The police produced something called Operation Paget. So you're going to hear a lot about that. And it's important to remember that Operation Paget is basically a response to Mohammed Fayed's allegations. And then after Operation Paget, you have the inquest. And the inquest goes on for about 8 months. And it concludes at the end that Diana was killed by a driver who is impaired with alcohol or drunk, Henri Paul, who is speeding, and she was also killed by the pursuing paparazzi, who are unidentified. So just to be clear, the finding of the inquest is that Diana was killed by unknown people. And I think that's the sort of first point to start from, that is just completely unimaginable if you imagine that it had been anyone other than Diana in that car. Partly because, as a journalist, I know that when I turn up to a job, I know everybody there, right? Because they're all in the same industry. When you go to an event within your industry, you know everybody, right? Especially with paparazzi in the 1990s. They knew who each other were, right? Partly because cameras were quite expensive then, right? So there weren't very many of them. And they drove around on the back of motorbikes taking photographs of people. So the only one that's ever been identified is Romo Ra, right? Who's the one paparazzi who's ever been identified. It just makes absolutely no sense. Well, all these other people were able to speed off. No one was able to say who they were. There's no CCTV because all 10 of the CCTV cameras are out of action or pointing the wrong way. So nobody knows who any of these people are. I mean, that's just completely nonsensical.
Because a paparazzi wouldn't have driven away.
No.
Right? I mean,
they didn't cause, like, they weren't doing anything wrong. You're allowed to chase after a car and take photographs.
Yeah.
Like, that's not a crime. And they would have stayed to take photographs of the police turning up, of the crash, of the smash, which, by the way, is what we were told that they all did. Do you remember there was this narrative, like the awful paparazzi climbing over the cars and taking photographs of her while she was dying and all this kind of stuff? Like, you know, so where are these people? Who were they? What are their names? Like, we've just got one of them. You know, it's also, absolutely weird.
Sorry to sound crass, but, you know, this is not my words because it sounds disgusting, but if you get inside the mind of a paparazzi, and we're talking about a street paparazzi back in the day when paparazzi pictures were huge currency, that is the picture. The picture, they're not going to leave that's a money printing machine.
They'll pay your mortgage. They'll pay your mortgage.
And
they'll pay your mortgage off that photo. So, okay, but right, the other thing, okay, that everybody knows about the crash, the death of Princess Diana, okay, is that it was a drunk driver, right? That's the one thing that we all know, okay? But it's that, again, it's just complete nonsense. Harry himself, in his book, says, he writes this passage saying that after the inquest, he sits down and talks to William, and they agree that the finding, i.e. that it's been caused by a drunk driver, is absurd, simplistic and absurd. And he says that he's driven through the tunnel himself, and I've actually been through it, and anyone who's been to Paris has been through that tunnel. And he says, even if the man was completely shit-faced, and those are his words, he would have been able to drive through that tunnel without crashing the car.
Small.
So, yeah, right. It's not like, do you know what I mean? Like, also, by the way, the French, like, they drink and drive, right? I mean, they certainly did back then. Like, I remember stopping at the garages and being horrified that the garage, the set meal included a carafe of wine, you know. But that's beside the joke. I'm not in any way endorsing drunk driving. But what I am saying is that immediately after the crash, the French police come out and they go, "It's all Henri Paul's fault. He was as drunk as a pig." Right? These are their exact words. They haven't done any blood tests, any toxicology tests or anything by this stage. So within 12 hours, they're saying he's as drunk as a pig. Then, when the toxicology reports come back, the blood from Henri Paul says that he has 20.7% carbon monoxide saturation in his blood. This is not disputed. This is French police report. This is in Paget, and this is in the inquest. And Paget looks at this and it says, yeah, well, there must have been a mix-up at the lab. The samples must have been contaminated, and so that's probably not accurate. But then they are, because he couldn't be honestly, if you were 20% carbon monoxide, you might just about be able to sit up, but you'd be kind of, do you know what I mean? You'd be like, seriously, and so they say, yeah, that blood test is probably wrong, but, you know, French police probably, it was the weekend, it was August, they were all on holiday, they were too busy eating their baguettes or seeing their mistresses in the south of France, whatever the hell they were doing. But the blood test showing he was drunk, that's totally fine. You know, you're like, well, it came from the same, lab. I mean, it's not the same vial of blood, but it came from the same lab. Do you know what I mean? Like, and
this already, it's like red flag. I mean, this is Princess Diana, and not to say that if this had happened to any of us, we wouldn't deserve the same level of attention. But all eyes.
Well, we wouldn't get it. That's for sure. I mean, you know, it's that's why I say it's really important to understand the context. This being the most famous person in the whole world.
Yeah.
It's not like just like a normal person. It's a massive deal, you know. And I'm sorry, the blood. Anyway, lots of people think that the blood samples were switched with a suicide victim, basically, who monoxide himself. Right. You know, like, that is, for me, when I actually went, it's weird because at the time I was a pretty young journalist, believe it or not, in 1997, and I didn't really think it was my place to go, this is all a load of rubbish. Do you know what I mean? I just sort of did my job and reported, and, you know, I wasn't like at the sharp end of it. I was just doing colour around the edges and that kind of stuff. I wasn't, you know, but it was really weird when I went back again. I think, you know, the intervening sort of 20 years of just the sort of collapse in trust of governments, the WMD, you know, for me, one of the big things was the WMD in Iraq, you know, took 45 minutes from mass destruction, like absolute rubbish, completely made up just to justify, you know, and there were all these kinds of things. I think we all became a bit more questioning of what we were being told by the cops. And it was just incredible when I read that, and I'm like, hang on a sec. His blood sample is 20% carbon monoxide, and yet the CCTV of him stopping, bending down, tying his shoelace, standing up and walking on again just before he gets into the car. Trust me, if you were 20% carbon monoxide in your blood, there's no way you could stoop down and tie your shoes. You also, by the way, couldn't stoop down and tie your shoelace if you were so drunk you were going to just smash your car into the side of the bridge. I mean, it's like, what, you're just driving like, you know, I mean, it's just, it's nonsense. It's absolute rubbish. And of course, what actually caused the car to crash was that it clipped a white Fiat Uno just before it entered the tunnel. We think it's just before it entered the tunnel. And again, like, the whole story about the Fiat Uno is absolutely crazy, and I could not believe it when I went back and read all about it. So first of all, the French police just denied that there was a collision with a Fiat Uno to start with. Then after about 6 weeks, they said, yeah, actually, we've sampled the paint on the Mercedes, the collision, we've found paint and we've tested it, and it does match a white Fiat Uno. It then turned out that there's a freelance photographer called James Adanson who has a white Fiat Uno. The police go and look at it and they say, well, it couldn't be this one because it's got 300,000 miles on the clock. And you're like, well, what's that got to do with anything? You know, it's driving. It's like plenty of people in Paris, in London, in New York keep battered old cars as almost a point of principle, you know, so that they can just park it wherever they want and they can get more battered. Like, so, but then the extraordinary thing about this whole thing then is that Paget says, well, could we talk to James Danson and find out what happened to his Fiat Uno, which was not involved? And the French police say, I'm terribly sorry, you can't, because he committed suicide in the year 2000, was found dead in a burnt out car with a hole in his head. And you're like, that does seem a bit odd. And then 6 weeks after that, his offices are broken into. His office of his agency is broken into, and a whole load of files and stuff in it. And again, this is in Paget. So the British police say to the French police, and was any of his stuff taken, like in the break-in of his office that happened 6 weeks after he died in really weird circumstances? No, nothing of his stuff. We checked it out. Nothing of his stuff was
Nothing
taken.
to see here.
And it's
Move
just
on.
like, yeah, but it's amazing because what I think is so clever about the fact that it happened in Paris is that everything can get lost in translation. So anything weird that happens, the British police can just blame it on the, you know, cheese-eating surrender monkeys, and or the fact that things are done differently, or the fact it's the weekend. Like, a lot of stuff is blamed throughout this on the fact that it's a weekend in August and everyone's on holiday. You know, the fact that the carriageway is reopened less than 12 hours after the accident is blamed on the fact that the person who should be in charge is on holiday in the south of France. But I'm sure they were, but get them on the phone. Do you know what I mean? And of course, the thing that's really weird about the carriageway being reopened, power washed, and the car removed really quickly,
Power washed
is that with detergent. Is that the Pont d'Alma is two carriageways on each side, so you can fairly reasonably easily, I mean, not reasonably easily, it'd be a massive pain in the hole for everybody, but you could actually turn that other carriageway into a single carriageway, you know, for 48 hours. Given that the most famous person in the world has just died in a car crash there, I think that wouldn't be unreasonable. And I think what happened was that I think Diana's car clipped the Fiat, and I think that precipitated the accident, either because it was a sort of chaotic moment of confusion, or because the Fiat's airbags went off and just everyone panicked. That's what I think happened, and I think it's weird that car was never traced. I just find it really, really, really weird. And the one car that fits the explanation that happens to be owned by paparazzi. I mean, it's okay. I mean, look, there's a lot of white Fiat Unos in Paris, sure.
Yeah.
But come on.
What do you, before we go on to your other findings, what do you say to people that say, well, Diana had security that night. She chose to change the plan. She chose to, you know, go where she went. What does that fit into the kind of theory of what you've worked on?
Well, I think the standard objection, right, to that this was a grand conspiracy, is how did they know where she was going to be? How could they just act on the spur of a moment? They were meant to be staying the night in the Ritz, and then they went off to their private apartment on the Champs-Elysees. They were that was where the accident happened, was between the Ritz, which was owned by the Fayed family, and the Fayed's private apartment on the Champs-Elysees. They weren't even supposed to be in Paris. They were supposed to be in the south of France. How do you get everybody there? Like, it's all too complicated. It's too fantastic. It presupposes a collaboration between the French and the British security services, not to mention the Americans, who are sometimes implicated. And my answer to that is always the same, which is, do you know what? Other people's jobs always look really difficult. And we look at other people's jobs and you go, how the hell did you do that? But if your job is organizing operations like this, you find a way to do it. And don't forget that Henri Paul received 3 payments, and this again is not disputed, it's in Paget, received 3 payments of about 80,000 francs on 3 successive months prior to the crash. About $50,000-$60,000 in today's money. A substantial amount of money in cash that he just pays into his bank account. His mother said it was from tips from grateful passengers. Well, that's quite a tip, isn't it?
Right, I'm changing careers.
Yeah. I think that Henri Paul thought he was providing information to media, and I think that's what he thought he was getting paid for. I think he might have been providing information to someone else inadvertently. I don't think he was in on it, actually. If he was, he made a very bad call, right?
What's really important to remember is, and I looked into, I've done a lot of research in things like the CIA as well. And by design, we're not meant to be able to put all the pieces together. So, you know, if someone is playing devil's advocate and said, well, how did Diana do? You know, she decided to do this, that, you know, they don't want us to be able to effortlessly connect the dots. And so I think what's so genius about what you've done is you've worked in mainstream, you've got so much investigative frontline experience, and you've taken time, and actually it from your findings, it's clear as day to me. And I think you made a point earlier in the interview that things weren't making sense to you at the time in 1997 when you were at the Evening Standard and you had questions then. I think it's really important to remember the news agenda. When you're in that mainstream bubble, it moves so fast. You barely have time to eat dinner. And so the thought of actually having time to connect dots and research things and actually take a story and explore it is just sometimes really not possible, because as a young reporter, you are under so much pressure and the news agenda is rapid.
I think what's really, I think that's true. But I think what's also really interesting, looking at Paget from a distance of, 22 years since the report was done, what's really interesting is how incredibly complacent the people writing it are, because they just write these incredible things, just knowing that no one's going to question it. No one's going to turn it over. There is no YouTube. Like, you may have loads of questions about Paget in the year 2003. You don't actually have any way of broadcasting them, right? You don't, there's literally no way that you can disseminate your opinions other than to go and stand on Speaker's Corner, which is what some of these people did, or write a book, which is what some of the other people did, which brings me on to a really fantastic character in this story, who's the landlord of the French House pub in Soho, who's a guy called Noel Botham. And he was an old mirror hack, and he was absolutely convinced that Diana was murdered. And the French House is kind of really sort of quite shabby. Well, it wasn't, it's probably very fancy now, but it was quite a shabby old boozer, not on Old Compton Street, but one of those streets around there, with a sort of counter and, you know, all that kind of stuff. And the palace flunkies used to go there, and the security services used to drink there, and all kinds of people, because they were all attracted by Noel, because he was this incredibly vivacious character. He was actually, interested as a side note, he was the founder of something called AAA, which stood for Anti-Alcoholics Anonymous. And he explained that it was an organization which, if anybody was seriously contemplating giving up drink, they had to give him a call first so that he could persuade them to change his mind. So he was one of these kind of old Christopher Hitchens type, cigarettes, drink, blah, 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 and, all of that. And he wrote this brilliant book called The Murder of Princess Diana, that's a bit of a cult classic in the Dianerology, and as he says, it's just all laid out. It was just like there wasn't even any effort really to hide it. It was just a sort of very deep, and when you see things like Diana writing letters to Paul Burrell saying, my husband's planning an accident in my car, it's like, I mean, I'm sorry, but if my wife had written a letter to somebody saying, my husband is planning an accident in my car, and then she died in the car, do you know what? Like, I'd expect to spend a few nights in jail, like in the police station answering questions. Like, there was
She
no
was so
proper
ahead of the time.
investigation, really.
She was so ahead
Yeah,
of the time as well. You know, I think there's a large consensus that Charles hasn't stepped up to the role of being king. And, you know, we're going back decades that she was so intuitive and really
yeah,
super, super smart and savvy. But
yeah,
there was some more of the information that you found that I just thought was unbelievable was after the road had been cleared and everything, they embalmed Diana's body rapidly, didn't they?
yeah. I mean, that's just extraordinary, isn't it? So yeah, so Diana died at about 4 a.m. She was pronounced dead. At 4 a.m. she was pronounced dead. Charles would arrive to take her home. He arrived in Paris at about 3 or 4. I think she was home on British soil in time for the 9 o'clock news. So, and I remember seeing it live, him arriving in the plane with the coffin. In that time, Diana's body was embalmed, and there's confusion about the term. What it means actually is that all of the blood was drained out of her body, destroyed. None of it was kept; it was destroyed, and replaced with embalming fluid. It's done typically. It is often done. It does improve the cosmetic appearance of the person, because otherwise the blood makes you look sort of ghastly and horrible, and
Yeah.
so it is done, but it's not always done. It's not always done, and it's a complete myth. Again, it's always done in France. I mean,
Is it
and even
common
if
to
it is
get rid
always
of
done,
all the blood? Because that
yeah,
seems
exactly. Even if it was always done, a sample of the blood should have been kept,
yeah.
and it shouldn't have been done. It shouldn't have been done, and that has always triggered, Mohammed Fayed, above all, saying that the real reason that Diana was unalived was because she was pregnant with Dodi's child. And, her and Dodi, I do believe that she was going to get married to him. I do believe that he had asked her to marry him. Again, like, it's in Paget, the CCTV footage, you've been going into a jeweler and picking up an engagement ring. I mean, it's not, and that's the thing that I find so amazing about it. There's another brilliant guy who's really, really authoritative writer on all this, called John Conway, who wrote a play called Truth Lies Diana. And John is so funny. When I spoke to him, he said, "Do you know what?" He said, I was writing about this for 6 weeks, and you're very kind to call me a wonderful investigative journalist, but I kind of agree with John Conway. And John said to me, you write about this for 6 weeks, and it's just so obvious. It's just all hiding in plain sight. And what John said to me, he said, I spent my life writing TV shows for Basil Brush, and I was able to turn up incredible anomalies within like 5 minutes. And that, at the end of the day, is the thing about it, that there's just too many anomalies, there's too many unanswered questions, there's too many weird things that happened, in the immediate aftermath. Look, the other explanation is loads of people messed up and they were trying to cover up to save their asses and save their job after the fact. Right. And I have a bit of sympathy with people who think that, people made some awful mistakes, in the ambulance taking an hour to get to the hospital is another famous example, right? And again, what you always hear when you say, why did the ambulance take an hour to get to hospital? They say, that's how they do it in France. The ambulances are really good. And I'm like, yeah, I mean, I'm sure they are, but they're probably not as good as the hospital, right?
And I also think, say, well, we're now, we've never been more kind of encouraged by our lack of distrust to kind of government and mainstream media to become critical thinkers. We were not critical thinkers when Diana died, and it was very much, the Daily Mail. I remember, you know, and I think grandparents still do live and breathe the Daily Mail, and it was the news. It was such a
Yeah, it's
different
the
time.
BBC.
Yeah, and our
Mm,
whole
mm,
kind of consciousness was programmed by this propaganda, which we now know the mechanics of what goes into our news and how deeply distorted it is. But it was such
mm,
a different
mm,
time then. And I wonder, do
yeah.
you think that, do you think Charles was aware? Because for me, I would imagine, was it,
No, I don't. I go with the
you
Thomas
don't?
Becket theory. I go with the Thomas Becket theory. You know, I think that he was the king saying, who will rid me of this terrible breed? And I think the people who did it deliberately would not have told him, because I think it was very important that Charles had complete deniability and that Charles was as stunned and shocked and horrified as everybody else. But ultimately, you know, it's hard to see Diana. It's hard to see it as not convenient for Charles what happened to Diana. Like, I just don't think he'd have been able to get on with his whole program of making Camilla queen, of
Yeah.
him being king, of I just don't think he would have been able to do that with Camilla's with Diana sniping from the sidelines and saying what a terrible man he was and that he'd been having an affair with this woman for 50 years. And I just can't see it. I just can't see it. And I think that, you know, look, to be fair to Charles, I take my hat off to him. The man's fighting cancer. He's doing an amazing job. He's going out. He's being seen. He's doing as much as he can, and he's been incredibly brave. And I think weirdly, having thought in the run up to it, he was going to be the most terrible, terrible king. I think he might be a bit like Edward VII, who, you know, only ruled for 8 years, but turned out 9 years, but turned out to be a fantastic king. I think Charles has got potential, actually, weirdly, despite all this, to end up as a kind of national treasure, especially if he can survive this cancer. Maybe he abdicates in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time, if he survives and he abdicates and we all go, my God, wasn't Charles wonderful? You know, I don't know. I don't think what was done to Diana was right, but I do understand why it was done.
Yeah. I mean, it also makes a lot of sense, your hypothesis and kind of what you've presented as to Harry's deep, deep mistrust and mistrust of everything, really, but also him wanting out of the establishment because, you know, there's him and William obviously are not speaking.
Yeah.
Everything with
Why do you think he
Charles has
goes on
been,
about his security so much?
yeah,
You know,
it's a
that's why
really,
he goes on about his security. That's why it's such a big issue to him, because he did have a good relationship with his security detail, you know, and he did, and he trusted them, and he knew that they put him first, and he felt protected. And, you know,
yeah,
he saw what happened to his mother. Like, he's been very, I'm told that he definitely feels that there's a lot more, you know, he said himself openly that he feels there's a lot more to it. And that she was the victim of a plot, you know, and I'm really hoping that he does do a Netflix show about her. I think it would be absolutely
well,
brilliant.
not a movie
I think
though,
that
not a
I
glossy
think a
movie.
movie, a film, a series, whatever it is, I think he should do. I think it would be brilliant. Like, that book Spare. You know, the first third of that book where Harry's talking about life at Balmoral, his relationship with his mother, that sort of last lyrical summer at Balmoral, and every door you open, King Charles is behind it doing a headstand, and, you know, it's brilliantly written. And then this horrible, you know, tragic end to this sort of wonderful summer that they're having with his father. You know, literally the last day of the summer, his father sitting on his bed saying, well, I'm terribly sorry, dear, but she didn't make it, and not even giving him a hug.
Yeah,
I mean, it's so gut-wrenching, and it's very clear reading that where what Harry's trauma is all about and what everything is all about. And I think he made it very clear that he has loads of unresolved questions about it. And he's also said that he's seen all the MI5 files about her death. He said that in his book. And look, I'm never going to be able to get answers or access to the level that Harry can get them. I think Harry might do it. I really think he might. And I think that if he's got any sense, He'll certainly make some kind of film about her for the 30th anniversary. I'm told that him and William are actually both planning to make films, so we could have a Barbenheimer situation. But I think it'd be the television event of the decade. I tell you, it really, really would be. Harry and Diana, all of Diana's friends, and it'd be incredible.
What I find though? And I think, I've always been very vocal that Harry's lost his mother, and everyone else has had their say about Diana. It makes complete sense why Harry would want to. But I do find everything about Meghan Markle so deeply disingenuous, and it reflects on Harry. And I think that's a shame, because actually, what you're saying about the MI5 files and all of this side of things, actually, if you look back at since Harry left the royal family, he's really been speaking in riddles as far as he can, I believe. People weren't really aware of the royal rota to the extent they are now. They weren't aware of how in bed the royals are with the mainstream media. And Harry has lifted the veil massively on that, hasn't he? And people have a lot more transparency on it.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think to an extent, obviously the mainstream media need access to the royal family, and so they agree to certain rules. But don't forget that also the mainstream media are subject to the press guidelines, right, and the rules in this country. So if somebody came to me, Lauren, seriously, if somebody came to me when I was working at a newspaper and said, I have got cast iron information that King Charles has bladder cancer, right, and he's going to die in a year and a half time, you can't run it, because under Leveson you have a right to privacy of your medical records. So you actually can't. So it's not quite as simple as just saying they cover everything up. It's really, really not. And
but I would argue that Ipso paid for by the press. I think Ipso do an incredibly shoddy job of, monitoring the press.
I agree.
Yeah.
I totally agree with you on that. Yeah.
And I think Leveson Part 2, I think the fact it's not happening is a travesty. And, we've been let down massively.
Yeah. I mean, but I'm just saying that, like, I don't think that, sorry, I can't actually even remember what your point was, but you were saying that they're in bed with the...
Yeah, I think, the mainstream media and the royals have an incredibly close relationship. But I think and I was saying that I think what Harry has done since leaving the royal family is actually he's given the public a lot of information and shed a lot of light on the mechanics of how it all works.
Absolutely. I mean, Spare was like incredible, like the insight into the cooperation between the press and the palace was, I think, really, really fascinating. I actually don't know if it's terribly interesting for people who don't work in the media, but but yeah, of course. And look, I've been kicked off all the royal rotas for writing stuff that they don't like. So I was on the international rota. I got kicked out because I wrote a story, about Charles's cancer. But I would say that there are plenty of critical stories about the royal family in the mainstream media that they do try to crush, because much as the mainstream media loves the royals and like Beeston, they also love sales, and nothing sells like a good bit of royal scandal. So if they get a nice bit of royal scandal, I tell you, they're going to try their hardest to run it.
The royals they also do need the scandals, and they do need the negative press, because otherwise people will get narrative fatigue. So actually, I would argue that the bad press is as good for them as the good press, because otherwise what's the story? Obviously Andrew's an awful story, that there's nothing good to come of that. But actually that kind of push-pull relationship with the mainstream media is what keeps the royals front and center.
So you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And even all the negative stories. So it's a really good point. like it all increases their cultural footprint. So if you think about Diana and all of the terrible, you know, revelations that came out about the awful way they treated her and the awful way Charles treated her and blah blah blah, actually without Diana, I doubt you'd have the series The Crown, for example, because I just don't think people care. Like, but it does. So the negative stories make people care. But yeah, like I don't want to get into whether or not things are being.
Do you think,
you know,
Harry has
my view is that there's lots of journalists working in the mainstream media working really hard to bring incredible scoops. You know, my friend Valentine Lowe, he was the journalist, he was the royal reporter at the Times for like 20 years. He's just written amazing books, like exposing all kinds of shenanigans that they're up to. You know, just the other day, the Telegraph wrote an amazing story saying that Harry was going to be invited to King Charles's funeral. The palace went mental. They were threatening to kick people out of the Royal Rota. They were threatening to remove people from the bridge briefings. So, yeah, it's not all one-way traffic. But I agree with you. It is a bit cozy, the relationship on some levels.
And do you think Harry has read your piece?
I don't. I suspect not. I suspect his people have. I do think that Harry has stopped reading a lot of the stuff that's on. We know that he was reading it before because he said that he was. He said he was reading the comments under newspapers with articles, which is never a great idea. I know that they read some of my stuff from sources, and you know,
Is your source Harry?
My source is not Harry. I can tell you that much. I don't usually discuss my sources, but I am prepared to say that my source is not Harry.
Go on the record and say not.
I can go on the record and confidently state that. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I imagine they read some stuff. I'm pretty certain they read my stuff in the Daily Beast because there were just so many of my clips on the film that they made. They're just all the headlines were like my headlines.
So, definitely. And I think
guess they read the stories, but maybe not. In fact, that reminds me of a funny story. Valentine Lowe, good friend of mine who works at the Times, meeting Prince Philip. He's been the royal correspondent at the Times for 20 years. He goes over to Prince Philip and goes, "Hello, sir." You know, and Prince Philip goes, "Hello, hello. And what do you do?" "I'm the royal correspondent at the Times, sir, but never mind." So, oh, there you go.
Awkward. Well, I just wanted to say thank you for, you know, sharing everything with us over the last hour, but also for all of the investigative work, because I do think the news agenda moves so quickly, and
thank you.
There are amazing investigative reporters, and whilst I'm not a fan of the mainstream media, I do know there are some great people within it, and I think this is a prime example of actually once and you think how many stories have not been, you know, seen through to the end. When you see something like this, you know, years down the line, you've actually pieced together something that I think effortlessly makes sense. There is no conspiracy in my mind. I absolutely do believe she was unalived. And I would urge everyone to check out your Substack, The Royalist, which is fantastic for all royal fans. But I think even if you might not consider yourself a royal fan, you will still learn lots on it.
Thanks very much, Lauren.
Thank you so much. Take care.